It was a warm summer afternoon in 2012. Laughter echoed across a quiet family farm just outside Toronto. Children were playing hide and seek between the trees, their voices rising and falling with the wind. Chloe, 11 years old, had just shouted my turn, then vanished. No scream, no footsteps, no sound. At first, everyone thought she was still hiding, but as the sun dropped and shadows stretched across the grass, a cold silence settled over the party. Search dogs came, police searched the woods, flashlights danced across the field. All they found was a small handkerchief, left under the wooden porch. 8 years later, Chloe's aunt was clearing out the old storage shed. She unlocked a door that hadn't been touched in years. Inside, a dusty backpack, a moldy granola bar, and a cassette tape labeled in shaky handwriting. Mystery of the locked room. Where did Chloe go? Who locked that door and why? Stay until the end. The truth is far more unsettling than anyone ever imagined. Her name was Margaret Reeds. She was 39 at the time, a quiet woman with tired eyes and a life filled with numbers. She worked as an accountant, lived alone in a modest apartment above a grocery store, and rarely asked anything of anyone. She spoke gently, listened more than she talked, and always remembered people's birthdays, even if they didn't remember hers. Family gatherings were never really her thing. She showed up, helped clean the dishes, stayed on the sidelines. But there was one person who always found her Chloe. A little girl with paint-stained fingers, wild curls, and a habit of slipping her hand into Margaret's when the crowd got too loud. Chloe didn't care that Margaret was quiet. She liked it. She'd curl up beside her during BBQs, show her sketches, whisper secrets no one else knew. On that summer day in 2012, Margaret had been the one watching over the kids. She had only turned away for a moment, maybe two, to bring napkins from the kitchen. When she came back, Chloe was gone. At first, it felt like a prank. But by sundown, when everyone else had started to panic, Margaret already knew. This wasn't just a game of hide and seek. In the days that followed, Margaret didn't sleep. She walked the woods with a flashlight every night, even when the others gave up. She played Chloe's voicemail over and over, the one where she'd said, "Love you, see you soon." The guilt settled in her bones. I was supposed to be watching her, she said, again and again, to anyone who would listen. But no one knew what to say. The family began to fray. Some blamed each other. Some pulled away completely. Margaret, unable to face the holidays without Chloe's drawings on the fridge, moved to a different part of town. She stopped answering certain phone calls. She only kept in touch with one person, Chloe's grandmother, a frail woman with a soft voice and a Bible always by her side. Some doors, the old woman once told her, don't stay locked forever. Sometimes, the truth waits until you're ready. 8 years later, that same woman passed away in her sleep. Margaret was the one named in the will to return to the family farm, to sort through what was left. The house still smelled like lavender and old wood. The shed hadn't been opened in years. The key was rusted. The air was heavy. And then she found the door. The day Chloe vanished was hot and still. The kind of summer day when time slows down, and even the trees seemed to hold their breath. The family had gathered under string lights and tall oaks, burgers sizzling, lemonade sweating through plastic cups. Somewhere between the laughter and the smoke from the grill, the children ran off to play hide and seek behind the barn. Chloe was wearing a yellow dress, the one with sunflowers printed across the hem. She had just shouted, "I'll count to 20," then spun around, giggling, hands over her eyes. Margaret had stepped inside for a moment, just a moment. She remembers grabbing a handful of napkins, humming to herself, and stepping back out into the yard. Chloe was gone. At first, no one panicked. Her cousins kept laughing, thinking she was just really good at hiding. The grown-ups passed around plates, poured drinks, called her name half-heartedly. Someone said, "She'll come out when she's hungry." And they all nodded. But Margaret's eyes were scanning the tree line, her voice rising just slightly each time she called, "Chloe?" As the sun dipped lower, the air began to shift. A silence crept in. It wasn't the good kind, the peaceful kind. It was the kind that presses on your chest. Makes your hands shake. Makes your voice crack. The kids stopped playing. The adults spread out. Flashlights were pulled from trunks. Someone finally called the police. By nightfall, officers were combing the woods with dogs, shouting Chloe's name into the dark. Margaret stood by the porch, fists clenched at her sides. She still remembers the soft crunch of dry grass beneath her feet, the sound of her own breathing too loud. All they found was a small handkerchief tucked beneath the porch steps. White, with one corner stained red. It was Chloe's. Margaret had embroidered her name on it the summer before. As the hours dragged on, suspicion began to take root. One man, a part-time gardener named Clyde, had recently been let go from the property. He was known to drink too much, mutter to himself, and disappear for hours during shifts. Margaret remembered seeing him earlier that day, standing near the barn, watching the children, watching Chloe. When questioned, Clyde claimed he left before the games began. There were no witnesses, no evidence, just a feeling, cold and sharp, like a thorn under the skin. Days passed, then weeks. Clyde packed his things and left town without saying goodbye. The police closed the case without charges. The official report listed Chloe as a missing person, possibly abducted, with no leads. Margaret didn't speak for days after that. Not really. She sat on the porch each evening until the fireflies came out, hoping for a sound, a sign, anything. Her hands trembled when she washed Chloe's empty plate. Her dreams turned cold. The guilt, like water, found every crack inside her. She was the last to see Chloe. She had turned away. And from that day on, she carried that moment like a stone in her pocket, always there, always heavy. For the first 2 years, Margaret did not rest. She wrote letters, dozens of them, some to the police, some to local papers, others to people she thought might care. She scoured message boards, searched through missing persons forums, and kept a drawer filled with printed flyers that no one asked for anymore. Her handwriting grew smaller, more rigid, like her hope folding in on itself. She knocked on every door in the area. Most neighbors were kind, but their answers were the same. Sorry, I didn't see anything. One woman said she remembered hearing a car drive off around dusk, but she wasn't sure. Another man said he saw Chloe playing near the fence, but couldn't recall who was nearby. Nothing solid, just fading memories, polite shrugs, and the kind of silence that makes your skin itch. The police called off the investigation after 7 months. No evidence, they told her. No suspect, no sighting, no leads. They mailed her a letter. Margaret didn't open it for weeks. When she finally did, it was brief, cold, 2 paragraphs. She folded it once, then again, then tucked it behind a family photo she couldn't bring herself to take down. The rest of the family began to move on, or at least they tried to. Holidays returned, though quieter. The back porch where Chloe once played was left untouched. Margaret noticed people stopped saying her name aloud, as if silence could protect them from pain. Most assumed Chloe had been taken, that whoever did it was long gone, that Chloe was gone too. But Margaret couldn't accept that. Deep down, something gnawed at her. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, like a song stuck in a dream. Something's not right. She whispered that sentence more times than she could count. Every morning, folding laundry. Every night, staring at the trees. She didn't know what was missing, only that something was. One rainy afternoon, she drove out to Clyde's last known address. It was an old trailer on the edge of a county road, with shutters falling off and weeds curling up the porch. She stood at the front step, hand poised to knock. But no one answered. Windows were dark. There was no sign of life. She waited 10 minutes. Then 20. The wind rattled a metal can across the driveway. She left, heart pounding. Back home, she called the police again. She asked them to reopen the case, told them she had a bad feeling. But they said the same thing. Unless you have new evidence, there's nothing we can do. So she stopped. Not because she believed it was over, but because her heart couldn't take the silence anymore. She packed Chloe's drawings into a small box, tied it with string, and placed it under her bed. If I keep looking, she once told Chloe's grandmother, I'll forget how to live. And so, she buried the dream. She kept the pain to herself, like a folded letter never mailed. Until one quiet afternoon, years later, when the shed behind the house whispered her name again. It was a cloudy afternoon when Margaret returned to the old farm to clean out the side shed. The yard was overgrown, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and fallen leaves. Dust clung to everything. Inside, the shed was dim, cold, filled with the scent of metal and age. She moved slowly, her hands brushing cobwebs from old crates, her breath visible in the still air. Along the far wall, behind a stack of broken chairs and rusted tools, she noticed something unusual, a wooden panel that didn't match the rest. The color was darker, the edges rough, as if it had been added later. At the center, a rusted padlock hung from a latch. Margaret knelt down, brought her flashlight close, and looked through a thin, uneven gap between the boards. What she saw made her freeze. Behind the wall was a small room. Not a storage space, not a crawl space. A room. 4 walls, a floor, and something lying in the center. Her hands trembled as she stood. She walked back into the house, heart pounding, opened an old drawer near the kitchen sink. Inside was a ring of keys, once belonging to her late father. One of them, she remembered, had never matched any door in the main house. With it in hand, she returned to the shed, took a deep breath, and slid the key into the lock. It turned. The door creaked open with a groan that sounded almost human. Dust billowed out in thick clouds, and the air inside was cold, colder than it should have been. As her eyes adjusted, she saw it clearly. A small, purple backpack lying on its side. Chloe's name, hand-stitched in yellow thread, was barely visible through the grime. Next to it, a half-eaten granola bar, long expired. A plastic water bottle, crushed. And near the wall, under a pile of blankets, a cassette tape in a cracked plastic case. On the label, written in a child's unsteady handwriting, were 5 words: Mystery of the Locked Room. Margaret didn't move for a long time. Her knees buckled, and she sat against the doorframe, hands covering her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks without sound. Her fingers were shaking as she reached for the tape. The case was brittle, but she opened it gently, like it was sacred. Back in the house, she dug out an old cassette player from the attic. It still worked, barely. The wheels clicked as they turned. Then static. A crackle. And then a voice. I'm Chloe. Today is the 3rd day. I don't know where I am. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. A child's voice, scared but calm. Margaret's body folded in on itself. She dropped to her knees on the living room floor, one hand on her chest, the other clutching the player. For 8 years, she had carried the weight of not knowing. But in that moment, something shifted. The air changed. She could almost feel Chloe in the room. The same voice that once whispered secrets into her ear now whispered from a machine, through time, through fear, through silence. Chloe had been here, in this house, in that room. Not gone, not a ghost. And maybe, just maybe she was still out there. Margaret brought the cassette to the police the very next morning. She sat across from a young officer with tired eyes and a tight voice. He listened politely, jotted down a few notes, and promised to pass it up the chain. But she could tell by the way he pushed the tape aside that he didn't believe it would go anywhere. It's been 8 years, he said gently. Without new evidence or a verified date, it's not enough to reopen the case. She walked out of the station with the same tape in her hand, her heart heavier than before. Rain began to fall as she stood under the awning, the cassette wrapped in a scarf to keep it dry. That night, unable to sleep, she remembered something. An old repair shop on Maple Street that used to fix cassette decks. She wasn't sure it was still there, but she went anyway. The shop smelled like solder and old paper. Radios lined the walls, stacked like forgotten memories. Behind the counter was an older man, white beard, heavy glasses, a flannel shirt too large for his frame. Margaret placed the tape on the counter and said quietly, I need to hear this more clearly. It's my niece's voice. He adjusted his glasses, placed the tape into a refurbished deck, and pressed play. Static. Then Chloe's voice. Today is the 3rd day. I can hear footsteps. The man didn't say a word at first. His hand hovered above the stop button, frozen. When the tape ended, he looked up slowly, eyes narrowed. That voice, he said. Is it Chloe Reed's? Margaret's breath caught. Yes, she whispered. He nodded once. 8 years ago, a man brought in a tape just like this. Said it had music on it, but when I played it, I heard the same girl's voice. Same tone, same words. He took the tape, paid cash, and never came back. He reached behind the counter and pulled out a yellowed business card, corners curled. On the back, scribbled in faded ink, were 4 words: Silver Pines Motel, Room 12. Margaret stared at the card for a long time. Her fingers shook as she folded it and tucked it into her coat pocket. She thanked the man, turned, and walked out into the rain, without an umbrella. By nightfall, she was driving. The cassette lay beside her on the passenger seat, along with an old photo of Chloe, taken the summer she disappeared, with paint on her hands and a smile half hidden behind her hair. The road stretched on, endless and wet. Silver Pines Motel sat on the edge of a quiet town, its neon sign flickering. Margaret walked to the front desk, asked about room 12. The young clerk shook his head. I've only been here a year, he said. No idea. But just as Margaret turned away, a soft voice behind her spoke. I know that girl. Margaret turned. An elderly maid stood in the hallway, holding a stack of towels. She pointed to the photo. She stayed here. Room at the end of the building. With a man, white hair, quiet. Never said much. Kept the curtains closed. Margaret's heart thudded so loud, she could hear it in her ears. The fog that had clouded her for years began to clear. She felt it now, urgency, certainty, fear. Something was opening. A memory. A truth. A door. Back at home, Margaret sat at the edge of her bed, the cassette still in her lap. The room was silent, except for the low hum of the fridge and the rain tapping on the window pane. She couldn't stop thinking about that old man's words. About the motel. About Chloe's voice. She opened a drawer, pulled out an old metal box filled with papers, and started digging through everything she had kept over the years. Clippings, handwritten notes, copies of reports. At the very bottom, folded between 2 envelopes, she found it. Clyde's employment record. She stared at the name for a long time. Clyde Monroe, the gardener. Fired the week after Chloe vanished. It hadn't meant much back then, but now she looked closer. There were scribbles on the back from an old background check, faint lines she had missed before. One phrase stood out, nearly faded. Prior charges, child endangerment, insufficient evidence, released. Margaret's hands turned cold. She reached for the backpack she had found in the shed, opened it carefully, and ran her fingers through every pocket. At the very bottom, between a folded drawing and a hair tie, she felt paper, thin, folded twice. A letter. The ink was smudged, the handwriting uneven, but the words were clear. Aunt Maggie, I heard you calling. I was behind the door. I wanted to scream, but I was scared he'd hear. Please don't stop looking for me. Please. Margaret gasped. Her chest tightened, as if someone had placed a weight directly over her heart. She pressed the paper to her lips. Oh God, she whispered. She was right there. That night, she called an old friend, Thomas, who now worked for a private security agency. He used to be a technician for the city's traffic surveillance system. She told him everything. He didn't ask many questions, just told her to give him an hour. 2 hours later, he called back. Margaret, he said, voice low. You're going to want to write this down. I checked the records for your street the night Chloe disappeared. There was an old brown sedan parked 2 houses down from your place for over 3 hours. The plates matched an older registry. Guess whose name came up? She didn't answer. Clyde Monroe. He was still alive. Still out there. Living in the outskirts of Kingston, under a different mailing address. Margaret didn't wait. She threw on her coat, stuffed the cassette player, the letter, and the photograph into her bag, and got in the car. The sky was dark, and the roads were slick. Her hands gripped the wheel tight, her knuckles pale. The headlights cut through the mist, like weak beams through memory. She played the tape again. If you find this tape, my name is Chloe Reed's. I'm locked in a small room. I don't know what day it is. I miss my family. I miss my Aunt Maggie. Please help me. The voice crackled, then faded into silence. Margaret didn't cry. Not then. She couldn't. All she could do was drive. Toward the man she feared. Toward a truth she had never wanted, but had always needed. Hope sat beside her in the passenger seat, silent and flickering. Somewhere beyond the fog was a locked door. But now she had the key. Clyde's house sat deep in the woods, past a broken fence and a gravel road that turned to mud by nightfall. It was made of old timber, paint peeling from the sides, with moss growing thick along the window frames. No mailbox. No neighbors. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time, and that's exactly how he wanted it. Margaret parked her car at the edge of the tree line, engine off, keys shaking in her hand. There was no signal on her phone, no bars, just a blank screen and the sound of wind rustling the trees. The night was cold, and the air smelled like damp leaves and rust. She approached the front door slowly, every step loud in the silence. She knocked once. Then again. Nothing. She leaned in, tried the handle. It was locked tight, but as she stepped back, she noticed a faint flicker of light coming from the back of the house. A thin, orange glow, like candlelight or an old lamp. Without thinking, she made her way around the side, shoes sinking slightly into wet earth. At the back of the cabin, beneath a low awning, there was a hatched door, half open, light leaking out from beneath. She crouched, heart pounding, and peered through the narrow gap. Inside, a small room. Wooden walls, a mattress on the floor, and by the window, a girl, shoulders slumped, hair long and unkempt, sitting so still she looked like part of the furniture. The girl turned slightly, just enough for the light to catch one eye. Margaret froze. Even after 8 years, even through the shadows and silence, she knew that face, knew that gaze. Chloe. The flashlight slipped from her fingers, hitting the ground with a soft thud. She gasped, hand over her mouth. For a moment, time stopped. But then she turned. Her only thought was to find help, to call the police, to finally end this. She climbed the hill, searching for reception, her legs trembling. Then, from behind her, a voice cut through the dark. "You shouldn't be here." It was Clyde. He stepped out from behind a tree, hair gray, eyes wild, a shovel in his hand. Margaret took a step back, then another. He moved forward. She turned and ran. Branches whipped her arms. Rocks tore her shoes. Her jacket snagged on a root, ripped down the side. She didn't stop. Blood ran from a cut on her palm, warm and steady. Behind her, she heard him yelling, but the tree swallowed his voice. She kept running. And then headlights. She burst out of the forest onto the road, waving her arms, screaming. A truck swerved, horn blaring. Margaret collapsed just short of the bumper, body hitting the ground hard. Everything went black. She woke to the steady beeping of hospital machines. The lights were soft. A nurse leaned over her, then stepped aside as a uniformed officer approached. "Ma'am," he said, voice gentle but firm, "we found the girl. And yes, it's her. It's Chloe." Margaret didn't speak. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only her tears did. Slow, quiet, like rain on the window of a house that had been waiting a very long time for someone to come home. They found Chloe in a small back room behind Clyde's cabin. The door was reinforced from the outside, the air inside thick with mildew and dust. There was a narrow cot pressed against the wall, a shelf lined with old books, and a few faded toys scattered across the floor. A cracked mirror hung crooked near the corner, reflecting a quiet figure who didn't turn when they entered. Chloe was no longer the child Margaret remembered. She was 19 now, tall and thin, her hair falling down in tangled waves. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just sat by the window, eyes fixed on the gray light coming through the dirty glass. Her fingers moved slowly over the edge of a worn blanket, as if counting the threads, again and again. At first, she didn't recognize Margaret. Not fully. Her eyes flickered over her face, but there was no spark, no sign of memory. Then Margaret opened her bag and pulled out the small purple backpack. Chloe's eyes fell on it. Her lips parted. She reached out with one trembling hand and touched the faded stitching. That's when the tears came. Quiet, sudden, unstoppable. During interviews with investigators, Chloe began to speak in pieces. Some memories were sharp. Others, blurred like shadows on water. She told them how Clyde had approached her during the party, whispered to her about a game, told her to hide in the shed for a surprise. She thought it was a prank. She thought it would make the others laugh. But the door locked behind her. For the first few days, she cried, screamed, banged on the walls. Then he came back and told her to stop, told her it was her fault, that no one was looking for her, that they had all moved on. Over time, he brought her food, books, small toys, things to quiet her down. He made up a story that she was his niece. He even taught her to sign his name on forms when they moved towns. "No one wanted you," he had said, "but I did." But Chloe never forgot Margaret. She never forgot the warm hand that held hers at barbecues, the gentle voice that called her Sunbeam, the way her aunt always carried extra napkins in her bag, just in case. And she never forgot her name. When she found old cassette tapes in one of Clyde's boxes, she began recording her voice, not to be heard, but so she wouldn't forget how she sounded. She would whisper into the recorder at night, tucked under a blanket, her voice barely above a breath. Sometimes she'd say her name. Sometimes she'd tell stories. Once she whispered, "Aunt Maggie, if you're out there, please don't stop." Margaret sat in stunned silence as Chloe recounted it all, her hands clenched in her lap, her shoulders shaking. But nothing broke her like the moment Chloe said, almost in a whisper, "I heard you that night. You called my name. You were just outside the door. I wanted to yell. I almost did. But he was standing behind it, and I was so afraid." The air in the room went still. It wasn't just a missing child case. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was nearly 10 years of silence. 10 years of being hidden behind a wall, while life went on just beyond reach. The monster hadn't taken her far. He hadn't needed to. Sometimes evil hides in plain sight, behind cracked windows and worn wooden walls. Sometimes the locked room isn't in a basement, it's right next door. Clyde didn't run far. By the time police reached the woods, he was pushing an old bicycle down the side trail behind his cabin. His backpack was already strapped on. Inside, 2 shirts, a pocket knife, and a roll of $20 bills. He didn't look back. He didn't think he had to. But they were waiting. The officers didn't fire a shot. He dropped the bike, hands raised, face blank. When they cuffed him, he muttered, almost to himself, "She was the only thing in my life that ever made sense." And then, louder, as if trying to make them understand, "I just wanted to keep something beautiful. She didn't belong to you." At the trial, the courtroom was silent as Clyde spoke those same words again. "She was never yours," he said to the room. "Never the world's. She was mine." His voice cracked, not with remorse, but with possession, a kind of twisted longing. He was sentenced without hesitation. Chloe did not testify. Her therapist advised against it. She had spoken enough. The law had listened. Margaret was granted legal guardianship of Chloe during her recovery. The house changed. The silence no longer felt hollow. It became a kind of softness. They built new habits slowly. Morning walks, quiet dinners, the same tea every night. Chloe didn't speak much at first, but her eyes followed Margaret everywhere. That was enough. 1 month later, Margaret did something brave. She invited the family back. Not all came. Some were still afraid to face the past. But enough returned to make the old farm feel full again. She planned the day exactly as she remembered. Grill on the patio, folding chairs under the oak, lemonade in glass pitchers. The same string lights, now weathered by time, blinked above them as the sun dipped low. Chloe sat at the table's edge, not quite inside the group, but not apart from it either. She wore a simple dress, yellow like the one from long ago, and stared at the sunlight flickering through the leaves. Her hands rested in her lap. She didn't speak, but her lips moved with the rhythm of the breeze. Then someone gently played the old cassette. It crackled. Then came the voice, her own, younger, fragile, reaching across time. Chloe stood. She didn't look at anyone. She walked across the yard, quiet steps toward the far corner, where the old wooden shed once stood. It was gone now. Only grass and wildflowers remained. She stopped where the door had been, closed her eyes. Margaret watched her, heart pounding. Her hand slipped into the pocket of her cardigan, where she still kept the handkerchief. It was faded now, soft from years of holding. She squeezed it tight, tears in her eyes. Not from sorrow this time, but from release. In that moment, something lifted. Not erased, not forgotten, but softened, like snow melting from an old roof. It was the first time in 8 years Margaret felt peace. Not because the story had ended, but because Chloe was finally standing on her own ground, in her own light, and she wasn't hiding anymore. During her final therapy session, Chloe sat across from the doctor, hands folded in her lap, shoulders still tense beneath her soft gray sweater. The room was quiet, warm, the ticking of a wall clock, the only sound besides their breath. "If you could say one thing," the doctor asked gently, "to your family, just one thing, what would it be?" Chloe didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted toward the window, where sunlight filtered through pale curtains. Then, slowly, she turned toward Margaret, who had been sitting in the corner, holding her breath without knowing it. Chloe's voice trembled, almost a whisper. "I always heard your voice," she said. "Every night. In my dreams. You kept calling, and I kept waiting." Margaret stood before she could think. She crossed the room and dropped to her knees beside Chloe's chair. She wrapped her arms around her niece, buried her face into her shoulder, and wept. Years of guilt, grief, and self-blame broke loose like a storm. She held Chloe the way she had always wished she had, tight, safe, unrelenting. The tears weren't only theirs. The rest of the family, seated behind them, watched through blurred eyes. No one spoke. They didn't need to. It was the first time in nearly a decade they had been in one place, whole again, no longer defined by the emptiness of what was missing. That night, back home, Chloe unpacked a small box Margaret had kept all these years. Inside were her childhood drawings, her favorite scarf, and a pencil case still smelling faintly of strawberries. Chloe said nothing, but her fingers lingered on each item, as if touching the past to let it know she'd survived. She asked for sketchbooks the following week, then pencils, then paint. Margaret didn't ask questions, just bought everything. Months passed. Chloe signed her name again for the first time on a blank canvas. Her real name, the one she thought she had lost. She painted slowly, day after day, the image taking shape with patience and weight. It showed a simple wooden room, a narrow bed, and a door, slightly open, light spilling in from outside. At the bottom, she signed, "Chloe Reads." The painting was donated to the local police station, where the chief had it framed and placed in the main lobby. Visitors passed it every day without knowing its full story. But those who did paused, looked closer, and felt something stir. On a soft spring morning, Chloe stood with Margaret in the backyard, where dew clung to the grass and the scent of blooming lilacs hung in the air. She turned to her aunt, her voice barely louder than the wind. "You know," she said, "if it hadn't been for that tape, I don't think I ever would have heard my own voice again." Margaret didn't speak. She simply reached out and held her hand. It was enough. Some wounds never vanish. Some silences never fully lift. But in the gentle hum of ordinary days, in the creak of floorboards and the rustle of trees, something deeper begins. Return. Not to what was lost, but to what could still be found. Chloe came home, but she was no longer the little girl who once vanished in the quiet of a summer afternoon. She had walked through years of silence, through shadows no child should ever know, and somehow she found her way back to the light. Margaret, once the quiet aunt who stood on the edges of family gatherings, became something more. She became the hand that held steady, the voice that never stopped calling, the woman who proved that sometimes love doesn't need to shout, it only needs to endure. In her final journal entry, Margaret wrote one line. "Sometimes, what we've been searching for waits behind the door we believed was locked forever." This story isn't just about missing girl. It's about the quiet power of hope. It's about a voice on a tape, a memory that refused to fade, and the belief that even the smallest thread of faith can lead us somewhere we never imagined. Chloe's journey reminds us all that healing doesn't always come with grand gestures. Sometimes it's a quiet breath, a soft voice saying your name, a door opening where you thought only walls remained. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34 verse 18. Thank you for walking this path with us. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Every view helps us continue sharing the quiet, powerful moments that live between ordinary lives. We'll see you again in the next episode of Hidden Stories.